In November 2001, Nick Wells and I traveled from London, Ontario to Cambridge, Massachusetts to film an interview with John Kenneth Galbraith. Nick wanted to talk to Professor Galbraith about his family history in Southwestern Ontario, but their conversation also ended up being a discussion about some of the events in Professor Galbraith's political and academic career, as well as some more personal recollections. Here are some excerpts from their conversation.
Mr. Galbraith, I want to ask you, when did your direct ancestors come to Southwestern Ontario?
Well, I was afraid you would ask me that. I don't have an exact date.
All right.
But it was very early in the 1800s.
And why Southwestern Ontario? Why didn't they go to Glengarry, Kingston area?
Oh, the same answer. That was where land was available.
Yes, but
some of it free and some of it in payment to Colonel Talbot.
Correct.
The Talbot estate, and it was on the whole better land than possibly than anywhere else in Canada. Wonderfully deep, stone-free or largely stone-free, fertile stretches of land, handicapped only by a heavy covering of trees.
Can your ancestors remember that, the heavy covering of trees, and did they tell stories about that?
One of my grandfathers, my father's grandfather, my great-grandfather, in the process of recovering the land from the trees, had one fall on him and died.
Ah.
That was the most prominent recollection in the family.
Besides being discriminated against by Colonel Talbot, was there any other discrimination faced by your family in the area?
Well, the discrimination involving Colonel Talbot, I think, has been largely invented after the fact. Mm-hmm. It rested on mostly on one thing, that he granted the land, granted from his land grant, his huge land grant in southwestern Ontario, a free contribution, in our case of 50 acres, with another 50 to be bought. And the discontent with Colonel Talbot was partly the big house he had, partly the lovely location he had at Port Talbot, as it was called, but partly on the price he asked for that other 50 acres, which might have been, some enormous price, like 50 cents an acre.
Yes. Do you know if your ancestors came to southwestern Ontario speaking any Gaelic or any other language besides English?
I think that in my case, my family's case, English went back to the time of settlement. But there were many families that came speaking Gaelic. And there were some, even in my time, so committed to their history that they taught their family, their children, Gaelic.
How did the people in the neighborhood feel about them speaking their traditional language?
Oh, it was purely, wholly tolerated, but probably a feeling that they were lending a little too much attention to their origins. It was thought to be a good-natured but slightly primitive form of education.
Can you remember any other ethnic groups in your area where your family settled? Were there any black families? Were there any native families?
Not to speak of, other than, of course, the Native Americans. Mm-hmm. One part of my clan in latter years settled in Dresden, and Dresden was close to or some part of the Underground Railway from the United States. And visiting a relative there, I was always shocked to have as one of my playmates someone who was black. It was a surprise that I was hardly prepared for.
What do you remember about Southwestern Ontario before you left? Before you even left to go off to college? Can you remember what it was like in that part of the world?
Well, yes. It was a peaceful, farm-oriented community. The farms were Scottish. The towns, Dutton, Wallistown, and so forth, were English. There was a certain amount of tension, as always, between the townspeople and the farmers. Tension that didn't preclude friendship or anything of that sort, but was based on the fact that the farmers worked hard to make money and then paid quite a bit of it to the townspeople for things they need on which to live. I don't want to exaggerate that, and I stress that. There was a sense of difference rather than any real tension. I never knew any real community tension.
Did you notice any tension in politics? Did one particular group lean towards one particular party?
Oh, sure. The farmers were liberals, and in the years immediately following World War I, were strongly given to the UFO, the United Farmers of Ontario. And the townspeople were considered to be intellectually somewhat backward and therefore Tories.
With the United Farmers, anybody in your family a member of that party at that time? Was politics talked about in your family around the table?
Constantly.
Can you remember any political discussions?
In the United States, my father would have been called a political boss. He was the permanent head of the Liberal Party in that part of Elgin County. And that position was rather taken for granted. And he was the person that candidates came first to see, and where he made his selection as to who he backed. And the first political meetings I ever attended were with my father on behalf of one or another of his candidates.
What were political meetings like? Can you remember your first political meeting?
Well, I remember the most distinguished.
Yes.
It was a favorite meeting was at farm auctions, because that brought farmers together, and the auctioneer would always give a little time, and there was one wonderful occasion when my father got up on the manure pile to make the political speech and apologized profusely for speaking from the Tory platform. The story is not original with him. I've heard it in other contexts. It just was something that had happened more than once.
How large a landholding did your family have?
150 acres.
150 acres. Did that go to the oldest son in the family, and was that considered?
Well, let me give a little history there.
Okay.
It's my impression, although it should be checked, that 50 of those acres came from Colonel Talbot, that 50 were purchased, and then another 50 were bought in my own time, up the road a bit. Okay. It was known as the 50.
And it would have gone to the oldest son in the family? Was that the tradition?
Well, that would have been the tradition. But by the time my father died, the oldest son had disappeared from sight to California. That was me.
That was you. Okay. Tell us something about why you chose not a farming career, but yet you went to an agricultural college that became a university.
We're out for blood and thunder, boys. We're farmers on a spree, were taking 4-year courses at the famous OAC. Put on your old red and blue sweater, for there isn't any better, and we'll open up another keg of beer, for it was not for knowledge that we came to this college, but to raise hell all the year. How's that?
Great.
Well, I was asked that question when I was up to Ottawa with my wife some 2 or 3 years ago to get an OC.
An order.
I am one of the 2 or 3 non-Canadian citizens ever to have received an Order of Canada. I was a very proud day. I enjoyed it very much. I put a look of false modesty on my face for several hours. And at the press conference, when the Governor General had finished, I was prepared for the first question, which was yours. Mm-hmm. Why, Professor Galbraith, did you leave Canada for the United States? And my answer, which was not spontaneous, I thought of it in advance, was, well, in 1931, when I graduated from college in Canada, I had the choice between grim, hard work on an Ontario farm and a leisurely academic existence at the University of California. And I do not think there is anybody in this press corps that would have made a different decision. And they got up and clapped.
The weather is much better in California. Tell us about some of the relationships in your family with some of your neighbors. How did neighbors help each other in those years after the First World War?
Oh, there was a very well-organized system of cooperation for thrashing, silo filling, and if some other special job had to be done. Or if a family, which was a rare occasion, had to be away, neighbors would do the chores, look after the livestock. That was exceptional, but was still possible. There was a strong cooperative relationship between farmers, between neighboring farmers.
Was there any growing sense of local history in southwestern Ontario, and did people in the neighborhood
There
talk
wasn't very
about
much. I don't think we were historically inclined. Mm-hmm. There was a certain mythology about Colonel Talbot, some true and some undoubtedly invented. There was one time when it was said that the city of St. Thomas was named for Thomas Talbot, and the saint was put in to make it ridiculous. I don't believe that. I think somebody invented that, but that story got around. But the truth is that that community was not historically oriented. It was oriented as to clan and family and to Scotland. And if somebody in his lifetime or her lifetime had some ample money supply, it was not exceptional to make a trip to Scotland and see what the old place looked like, and to come back and say how wise their ancestors had been.
Did you work to pay your way through college, or did your father help provide for you in order for you to get a higher education?
Well, we had an interesting relationship in our family. Certainly my father came up with some money, but wasn't much, and college was very inexpensive in those days. Tuition was nominal. Most of the money was for your board and lodging. But there were 3 of us, my older sister Alice, my younger sister Catherine, and she was enough older to have a school teaching job, which was the job that most women prepared for if they wanted to leave married life and the farm. And out of her salary as a school teacher, she helped me through college. I then graduated and got a fellowship at the University of California, and shortly after that, got an appointment at the University of California. The masterful job, salary of $1,600 a year. And out of that, I paid for my sister through college, including when I became quite affluent as a Harvard instructor.
Anything that we haven't covered?
Well, I would only stress one thing, two things. First, this whole neighborhood in which I grew up was Scottish. And there was a certain symmetry through the whole clan community that settled there. It wasn't exclusively from Scotland, but it was at least 90%. There was also, broadly speaking, some divisions within the Scottish community. There was one which was hardworking, sober, committed. There was another which was hardworking, committed, but not always sober. And a certain division as between the two. I suppose we could talk about this for a moment. On Saturday nights, the drinking Scotch, as they were called, assembled at the city in the town of Dutton at the McIntyre House. Notice the name McIntyre, where they had an evening of modest alcoholic celebration. And this was looked upon with grave disapproval by my family and by the non-drinking Scotch. They weren't tolerant of such aberration, in voice at least. On the way home, the drinking Scotch would take with them a small flask of whiskey to drink on the way home. And having consumed that, they would throw it away. And we were taught to pick it up, pee in it, and put it back on the road in case they thought they'd thrown away some whiskey. That was our contribution to the temperance movement.
Now, was your family temperance, and did you have to sign the pledge?
Father told me once that he had only once in his life tasted alcoholic beverages. And as to the family, certainly, we were brought up to believe that alcohol was evil. It took me years to get over that doctrine. I still haven't completely escaped it.
Well, there you go.
I still, to this day, have a certain feeling of guilt whenever in the evening I take a drink, much as I like it.
Oh, that's great.
We didn't talk about it. My father was a dominant figure in the community. In the United States, he would have been called a political boss. And he was generally accorded something between respect and affection by the whole community.
Can you tell me what qualities your father was looking for in a political candidate when they came to see him?
Oh, sure. He was looking for somebody who was solidly, aggressively for the farm community and the Liberal Party. And also, one of the great issues of the time, relations with the United States. The Tories were for protection. In the great election of 1911, they ran on the platform, no truck or trade with the Yankees. This was just the reverse of my father's view. partly for commercial reasons. That meant that the United States, Detroit, was a market for farm products, and that was certainly on his mind. But he also wanted good relations otherwise. I think he once told me, as a matter of fact, that there was no Canadian politician for whom he had such a high regard as Franklin D. Roosevelt. He said he would trade all his for FDR. That was perhaps an extreme attitude, but there was a little undercurrent of that feeling in all of my father's constituency.
Was your father alive when you worked for the FDR's administration? Was he very proud of you to know that you were working for his administration?
He certainly approved it, along with the salary I was getting, which was high by our Canadian standards.
When we were talking about...
I might point out that things were easy in those days as compared with now. I came to Washington one day, was put on the payroll the next. Nobody inquired as to whether I was a citizen or not, which I wasn't. I did have to swear that I was a Democrat, which I did.
And you wanted to share some of your reflections on the Talbot legacy in Southwestern Ontario.
Well, that wasn't, the Talbot legacy was not a great thing in my youth. We went to the Talbot estate at a place called Port Talbot for a picnic. And there was a certain marveling at the big house he lived in, where the fireplaces were so large that he could use a team of horses to haul the logs into the fireplace. That was thought to be a bit extravagant. There was some slight memory, dissatisfied memory, of the man who provided the land and then charged for the additional property. That wasn't something that was remembered with affection. And also remembered was his deputy, his assistant, Colonel Airy, who became indeed one of the great figures of the British Empire, because at the middle of the century before last, he was called back to active duty for the Crimean War, and his name and no other appeared on the order for the charge of the Light Brigade. And he never came back. It was always supposed that he was there answering to the Commission of Inquiry.
Tell us about Church Union in 1925.
Oh, I've written about that. That was a great moment in my childhood history. The question of whether the Presbyterian Church and what was it, the Methodists?
Methodist.
Should join together in the United Church. And this was a very important thing in our community, not for the church we went to. We were members of the Old School Baptist Church, commonly known as the Hard Shell Baptists. And the sad truth was nobody wanted us in the church union. The Methodists and one or two other constituencies went automatically, but the Presbyterians, who were a dominant part of the religious community and a dominant part in the local community of where we were born, they had, in a place called in the town of Wallestown, the largest, most elegant church. And so they had a vote on it. And it was really one of the most wonderful elections to watch in history. Even with all the commitment of a religious order, there was a certain inelegant persuasion a woman we knew was told that, a widow, was told that if she voted for Union, she couldn't lie when she died between her husband. And it was said that was the next thing she did, was say she was going to vote for Union because that was the last place she wanted to be, next to somebody she'd married reluctantly. And other things were made. It was known that if you voted one way, you got the girls, daughters of the family, got a place in the choir, which they might not get if you voted another way. And all of this, we old school Baptists watched with detachment and the greatest of pleasure.
Tell us more about Iona Station.
Well, Iona Station is not a vast city. It was originally just Iona, about 3 miles south, but or 2 miles south. But then the railroad came through, and Iona became Iona Station. There were 2 of them in my time. And I suppose I've said this before, it had the best communications of any place in Canada. If you got on a train, you went almost non-stop to New York City, stopped in Buffalo, and got on a ship, you were on your way to Liverpool. If you went the other way, you got off at Detroit, got to Detroit, non-stop to Detroit, and or I guess they might have been stopped at Windsor, and then on to Chicago and the Far East. Wonderful. The only problem being that the trains didn't stop. And I remember telling this for television one day after I'd written a book about that part of the world, telling this story. And as I told it, a train went roaring through. It was perfectly staged. A year ago, as we talk, a year and a few months ago, President Clinton gave me the Medal of Freedom, which is a nice thing, and it's the medal, most distinguished medal for a civilian in the United States. And gave me the nice ceremony at the White House, very bad for my sense of modesty. And a Canadian journal that somebody sent me who disapproved of some of my economic views said it was time that someone from Iona Station received distinction.
Can you talk about the role of the intellectual in influencing government policy and whether or not that's still true in this day and age?
Oh, it was dominant in the New Deal. The New Deal was a government in almost all departments of professional, intellectual community. Local leaders who were school teachers, going from Cambridge here to Washington on a Friday night, you could have a faculty meeting. So many professors were going down to advise on something on a Thursday night, I guess it was. And one of the forgotten facts of the Great Depression was that there was a desperate shortage of economists. So we were the favored profession of the whole period. When I arrived in Washington, as I said before, I was put immediately on the payroll for the next few months because of the shortage of economists. And this close connection between the New Deal and the academic community, which continued in Truman time and was also again very close in the time of John F. Kennedy, was one of the rewarding facts of that time. And today, that association is not nearly so close, and instead there is the very close, very important association between the administration and the corporate hierarchy, corporate management. A very large number of President Bush's senior figures are men and women, mostly men, who have made it in the private sector.
Well, that's a very good lead-in, because in Canada there's been a real push to seek corporate funding rather than public funding for universities. And what effect do you think that will have on our universities? Because I have a feeling that that's a parallel thing that's happened in universities here in the United States.
I do believe that public support of the universities is absolutely vital. Places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, a few others, get by without it in what is held to be a fairly distinguished way. But the great triumph in the United States and in Canada is the state and provincial universities. Those are the real light of the cultural, social, educational achievement of the two countries.
In your long career working for a number of different administrations, what was the most interesting election that you think that you witnessed over time?
The most interesting one for me personally was the election of JFK, John F. Kennedy. He was a good personal friend. I had known him from his student days, and that had a direct effect on our life, because I'd campaigned with him and was in line for a position in Washington or somewhere, and I had let him know that I wanted to be ambassador to India, and he appraised the situation on its merits, decided who would be best, and just called up the morning he was elected to say, okay, it's India. I think there's also a chance that he didn't want anybody quite so visible as I am too close to the White House. But I spent the next several weeks with him there as the administration got underway. But then I went to some of the most instructive, productive times of my life in India, the country that I'd come to love.
Why did you say to JFK, I want India? Why?
I'd been there as an advisor to the Indian government in the 1950s, and I had become, as so many others, attracted by India, attracted by Indian architecture, attracted greatly by Indian art, on which I've spent a large part of my studious study life, and I've written a book on it. And this going to Washington, where I'd already had one of the major jobs under Roosevelt. I was the price czar. They meant sitting there in those big leather chairs and hearing a discussion for another day of what you had already discussed for 6 previous days. And that was something that I didn't want to do again, where there was, on the other hand, the wonderful magic of India at that, particularly at that time.
Which one of your books was the most controversial or received the most criticism?
My most controversial book was The New Industrial State, which came after the Affluent Society, and argued that we'd gone away from competition to the great corporation as the power in the economy. One of the great indications of world change hit me a couple of weeks ago. I never believed it would happen. The Chinese got permission to publish the Affluent Society.
No, who would have thought in your lifetime that would have happened?
They paid me $1,800 for the first 30,000 copies.
What are some of the things that everybody likes to talk about at the dinner besides family matters? Are there any discussions that everybody joins in that you sink your teeth in and kind of go at it?
Inevitably and predictably. What is going on in Washington, and in recent months, how they could be improved.
We're going to wind up.
Wouldn't you like to have my wife join me for the...
No.
You ask her how she stood all these years.
Wait a minute, I have to think.
You tell us what life has been like with Mr. Galbraith.
I'd say we have a picture in the study of when Mrs. Kennedy came to India, and she was on the first elephant with her sister, and I'm always on the second elephant with him. And sometimes I don't show up because I'm smaller.
Do you feel it's always been the second elephant for you?
I haven't done anything outstanding on my own, but I have done some things.
Well, tell us what you...
She's written a very good book about India.
Yeah, except you wrote, well, yes, I wrote a book describing India. It did all right.
What did
she was my great bridge to Jawaharlal Nehru, who liked her better than he did me. He liked us both, but particularly Kitty.
Yeah.
What did you do your undergraduate work in and your graduate work in?
I did my undergraduate work in French and spent my junior year in Paris. And then I had a fellowship to go to Germany for a year. And I came back to Radcliffe in comparative literature, doing French and German and English.
When Mr. Galbraith was in Washington...
When he was in Washington in the OPA, well, my first child was born there when he was starting in the OPA. And then I decided that I wasn't just going to be at home, so I got a job at the Justice Department. And I was a translator analyst in the Justice Department during the war, while I was in the OPA. And that was a six-day-a-week job from 9 to 6. And then I was able to, on my pay, afford somebody to take care of my child when I worked. And I had a second child and went back to work again, but then we moved to New York, so I had to give up my job.
There you go.
And then I taught at Columbia briefly, and then we moved to Harvard, and I had to find other things to do, and eventually I taught a little bit at Harvard for 3 years too. But the jobs I picked up were the things I could fit in with my family, and except for during the war, that was a full-time job, but the others are certain numbers of hours a week.
The women in your acquaintance that you had, did the other women think that this was strange or this was acceptable, or
they were all working?
They were all working too.
Sure.
This was part of the effort during this time, and nobody thought that this was
not at all.
Not acceptable for a woman to do or anything like that.
And they were a pretty lively group too. We had very interesting carpools in Washington during the war. Especially I would be hearing a special news commentator who would be attacking my husband and saying, because of his keeping down the prices, and They would hear about what Fulton Lewis Jr. said about him, and how he must go.
My wife and I met in 1936. I was an instructor at Harvard, and she was a recent graduate of Smith College, summa cum laude. Her undergraduate record was considerably better than mine. And she was slender, beautiful, intelligent, and I was immediately attracted to her one day when we had lunch together with some others in an extremely inexpensive restaurant at Harvard Square. And we were married, spent the year 37, 38 at Cambridge University in England, with which I'm still connected. I'm a senior fellow there now until my ultimate demise, life appointment. If anything goes wrong, I can always go to Trinity College and have 3 meals a day. And we've, as I say, been happily married all that time. Okay, did you hear that?
Yes, I did.
All right.
Yeah.
You heard it all before.
Yes. The singing I've heard too.
It's been a quiet afternoon. I've been able to use you this excuse for doing nothing else.